Welcome back. A student has been shot and wounded during clashes between protesting students and police in Johannesburg. Police used tear gas to disperse the crowd a short while ago, rather yesterday, and several students had been arrested. It's day 2 today of the nationwide student protest. Students are demanding that those who are in debt be allowed to register and historical debt be wiped out. Jennifer Wells is a campaigner at Amnesty International South Africa. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Now, the protests have been marred by shootings. Is this a crisis of public order policing or policing in general? Because this is not just today, yesterday, this year. It's been ongoing for the past couple of years of student protests.
Hi, good evening, and thanks for having me. Absolutely. I think the way that you've described it as a crisis is absolutely spot on. This is a pattern that we are seeing consistently now when people are coming out and protesting. We know that we are the protest capital of the world, so police should be adequately trained in how to police crowd settings and protests. And it's an absolute crisis. We have seen in the last week and yesterday police coming out and using excessive use of force. They're using so-called less lethal weapons, which are rubber bullets are included in these. But there's this misleading that because they're classified as less lethal, that they won't cause as much harm, which we know is just not true, as we've seen an innocent bystander last week killed from rubber bullets and another student allegedly shot. And it's absolutely appalling. We are calling on law enforcement officials to comply with international and national laws and standards that govern the use of force in crowd settings, and to only use force when it is proportionate and when it is necessary.
So let's talk about that proportionality. When we talk about heavy-handedness, now there's a sense that this has become so endemic. Just looking at protesters, what happened to them at a protest in Ikwezi coal mine, where it was the response of police that was criticized. The protesters said the police got there and said, we're only giving you 10 minutes to disperse, and then started coming at them with water cannons, smoke grenades, etc. So just talk to me about how we define heavy-handedness, and has this become endemic within the system?
Yeah, so let's talk about when it is acceptable to use force. So it is only acceptable to use force when there is a threat of imminent death or serious injury. Only when the threat posed by the protesters corresponds to the threat that would come from the police using whatever force they're choosing to use, which in many cases is rubber bullets, which we know would cause death or serious injury. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about proportionality, is that there has to be a balance. It's not when protesters start to chant or whatever it is. There has to be a threat of serious injury or death for police to begin to use force. And even then, they should first fire warning shots. They should use means that we know won't cause death or maim or injury, such as water cannons or tear gas. But even then, firing rubber bullets or spraying tear gas in the face of people is in violation of international law. This is beginning to look like an endemic. In fact, if you look at the way that police are policing protests at the moment, it's exactly or almost identical to what we were seeing in the 70s, the 80s.
Now, groundwork says the senseless behavior seems to be directed or targeted at a specific racial group, black people, young black people. I want to hear your thoughts about this. And just judging from some of the reports of the protesters out there who are saying that police even threatening to shoot them at close range right on their foreheads to prove the point that they will control them if they want to become ungovernable.
Well, look, the people that we're seeing coming out and protesting on the streets are previously disadvantaged groups who are still suffering under the current state of affairs when it comes to education, when it comes to access to basic rights such as service delivery things, water, access to housing. It's the previously disadvantaged groups that are suffering the most. It's not your fancy suburb living people. So it's looking like it is targeting this group, and because these are the people that are suffering most, it is almost being targeted at them for that reason. And it's just unacceptable that the government is not being held accountable to delivering on the basic right to education, the right to housing, right to water, which are often the circumstances in which we see people come out onto the street and protest.
Another NGO, Abahlali Basemjondolo, was saying that it's an absolute disgrace that when people raise their voices, they are shot and killed. And you have just said that the people who obviously have cause to be out on the streets are those who are previously disadvantaged, who continue to be disadvantaged and discriminated against. So what does this say about the state in relation to freedom of expression, in speaking out against the quality of life or lack thereof?
Yeah, it's protesters and anyone living in South Africa have the right to express their grievances, and authorities have to respect this right. They have to ensure the protection of all bystanders as well when it comes to policing. So when you're talking about what it says about the state, what it says about the state is that they are not being held accountable or holding themselves accountable to their commitments under the Constitution to deliver basic human rights. We have seen in the budget speech and in the SONA address that consistently issues such as the right to education are not being addressed. The budget is not being allocated where it should be. And the government and politicians can expect this every year. Every year at the beginning of a new education year, we see students coming out and protesting against fees, and the politicians are not prepared. Why are they not earmarking the funds that need to be earmarked to prevent these protests from happening and to ensuring that everyone has access to their rights?
Now, just finally, will Mthokozisi's death become a so-called George Floyd teachable moment for our freedom and democracy in South Africa, for our police service?
I think it really should be. And it's similarly, the death of Collins Khosa also should. Last year we saw that he was killed by law enforcement officials as well last year. And that also rang in the ears and kind of was similar to the George Floyd situation as well. And I think that we cannot continue to see these instances of death at the hands of our law enforcement officials continue. It's not enough. When Collins Khosa was killed, Amnesty International actually reached out to the Minister of Police and wrote him a letter saying, we have these guidelines on the use of force, on how to police these types of situations. Train your officers, train your law enforcement officials, and they haven't taken us up on it. So the tools are there. We understand that these law enforcement officials are scared, but Becky Taylor needs to be held accountable to training his troops, training our law enforcement officials so that these instances stop happening.
Jennifer Wells, thank you so much for speaking to us, campaigner at Amnesty International South Africa. And as you rightly say, there are so many names to be named who have been the victims of police brutality, who've suffered at the hands of police, what many say is heavy-handedness of police. And